Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining the first in our series of webinars on the National Climate League and equipping citizens to make use of the data that's available to them. We have, over the last several months, collected a bunch of data from all of your cities. A number of you, I would say close to 100, have requested data and submitted it through the portal online, or had your municipal councillor submit it. And now it's time to make use of the data that's there. It's time to dig into it, visualize it, and then speak to the media about it, speak to your elected officials about that data. So the next 3 weeks, there will be 3 webinars tonight, focusing on the data itself, how to find it, how to sort it, how to analyze it, how to extract it. The second webinar next week will be about data visualization. We'll be looking at tools of online free data visualization and graphic design tools like Canva and Venngage. And finally, on the 18th of December, also at 8 p.m., all of these webinars, we will have a webinar given by the David Suzuki Foundation's communications lead for Eastern Canada and Quebec. And that will be about speaking to the media, dealing with media relations, and taking the data that you visualized and turning it into a story, turning it into an opportunity to intervene in your local media landscape. So with that said, I will pass it off to Nadia Jathu, our regional organizer in the Greater Toronto-Hamilton area. And she's going to introduce our speaker this evening and take care of moderating the webinar. Thank you so much, Nadia.
No problem. Thanks, Matt. So yes, our guest today is David. David attended Denver Climate Reality Leadership Conference back in February 2017, so it's almost been a year, and has over 19 years of experience in data and analytics. Sustainability and the environment are areas of passion of his, and he's looking to get off the sidelines and become more active with the Climate Leadership Corps in creating a greener future for Canada and the world. So thank you, David, for being here. I'm just going to pass it off to you now so you can talk to us more about everything going on.
Sure, great. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be here. So I appreciate the introduction. My background as well is I have done a couple of the presentations post-Denver 2017, but I really felt that I've been sort of sitting on the sidelines, and the climate today with regards to what's happening in terms of policy and the shift towards the environment, I just feel that it's necessary to take action and get more involved. So I'd like to encourage everyone watching this as well to do the same. So as Matthew said, this today is really all about data facilitating the conversations. And I've got a bit of a technology, sales, engineering background where we talked about different scenarios, different industries, and even though it does come to data, people really are interested in seeing spreadsheets or charts per se. It's really about telling the story. So what I'm really hoping to accomplish today is to find those nuggets, find those interesting data points within the climate data that's being released, so that you can actually sit down with your elected officials, your councillors, to really facilitate those conversations. So before we jump into it, a couple sort of tips that I want to share with everyone. And before I jump in, let me share my screen here. And I'll just ask Matthew or Najid, if that's not coming through, feel free to interrupt. But when it comes to data, it's really important to understand what it is you're looking at. The data sets that we're looking at are pretty straightforward, but it's good to understand, what those metrics and data points represent. So if we're looking at some of these primary indicators, we look at economy or health, or consumption here, electricity consumption. You can see here that it's sort of captured per capita. So if you start doing analysis and you're looking at some of these different indicators and you're pulling them together into one visualization, just make sure that you're actually doing a valid apples to apples comparison. So that's my tip is know your data. From there, let me jump into the data set that we're going to be looking at. So this is the Climate Hub, so no smoke and mirrors here. I'm going to be using the National Climate League open database as well, just to really start to get our hands dirty and see what the data is telling us. So my approach to the session today is really breaking it down into the college or university type courses, level 100, level 200, and 300. So 100 being, just the basics. How do you get in? How do you massage the data? How do you manipulate it? And we're just going to stay in Airtable for that first example. right? So if you're not too comfortable with, being a data wrangler and sort of getting it to jump through hoops, we'll show you a couple things that you can do right in Airtable. From there, we're going to take it up a step further, the level 200, where the data isn't always perfect. What are some of the nuances that you need to be aware of and how you work with that? And then the level 300 for those super data nerds out there like myself, what kind of compelling stories can you get the data to tell you? So we'll be looking at how we can jump through Excel and pivoting the data a little bit to get it to present nicely and to engage in other visualization tools that are out there. So the first piece is, looking at green buildings, for example. So if we want to look at the breakdown of green buildings across the country by cohort, how do we do something like that? So I really try and keep it simple, a methodical approach, working across the spreadsheet left to right. When you jump in here, what I want to make sure, first off, is make sure that nothing's already filtered or grouped or sorted. So the first thing I want to do, since we're looking at green buildings, I'm just going to click the column header here. Now, you can click some of the other, the toolbar icons here. It's an extra step. I try and find the path of least resistance myself. So what I'll do is I'll just click on Add Filter by clicking on the column heading there. In this case, I'm going to type in green buildings. You'll notice that as I type in green buildings, this is updated in real time for me automatically. So now I have green buildings. And fortunately, we have a very rich data set for 2018. So what I'm going to do is add another filter here. You can see that I'm now stacking these together. So green buildings and 2018 together. And so that's my data set. So relatively straightforward. We can now get into how we sort the data. So for example, if I wanted to see this in alphabetical order by municipality, let's say, what I would do again is just click on municipality and we'll do a sort last to first. But very similarly, if I wanted to sort by municipality or if I wanted to sort by cohort, I can again add a sort in here and I'll do an apply. Now, what I like about this is once I have the sorts, this is very similar to Excel. If I go in here and add my sort, if you notice that the little icon on the right-hand side, I can actually drag this back and forth to change the sort order for my columns as they appear in the data set here. So in this case, what I'm really interested in is the cohort first off, and then the municipality afterwards. So this is okay as it stands right now, but it's very difficult for me to find any of the data points that jump out at me. So the next thing that I would typically want to do is I'd want to group this down by cohort. And the cohort is primarily designated by the populations of the cities, so small, medium, or large. So what I want to do is group by this field. And now very easily and nicely I can see here, well, what are the green buildings for the small cities, the medium cities, and the large cities. So just staying with an Airtable, not having to jump into any other visualization tools, what I would typically do is just start to scan the response column here. So looking at the small cities, I can see that's 0, 2, 2, 1, so nothing really big there. Similarly, if I'm looking at the bottom up, I have 5, 2, 1, and then I get to Victoria where I have 14 cities, which seems interesting. It seems like it's a bit of a spike here. And if I similarly scroll down, I see that we have 5, 5, 21, 13. So sort of the story or the nugget that jumps out at me is that what's Victoria doing? They have 14 cities here. They're designated as a medium-sized city, but they're still holding their own when it comes to comparison against the large cohort of cities. So I think this would be sort of an interesting data point a bit further. So that's the first scenario that I had here. So just to recap, we wanted to look at the breakdown of green buildings. So very quickly, we can see what the green building indicator was for 2018 across the country and very easily broke it down by the cohort, small, medium, or large. And then we found this data point here of 14 for Victoria. Let me just pause there for a second to see if Matthew, if you have any comments or anything you wanted to add for this particular part of the demonstration.
The only thing that jumps out at me that I realize that we've hidden from this view, because we have the choice to show certain columns in this view or not, is that it might be useful for some people to choose to sort by province and to compare all of the cities in their own province. So that's something that, and you don't have the choice to show that view from your view there, but from the back end, I can choose to incorporate another column. So that's something that I'll do right now is add the province back into there. That's something that had been previously removed, and that way you can compare against all of the cities in a certain province, because often green building standards, for example, are unique to each province. So you could, kind of compare apples to apples within, medium cities within BC. And one point that I made on the earlier French webinar is that the data set as you see it today is the smallest it will ever be, which makes me very happy. So we have 750 odd data points, and each data point includes not only the response for that indicator, but also the population for that year of that city, and the density of that city in that year based on its area for that year, which the area isn't included there, in addition to the number of households. So depending on the indicator, you can choose, and depending on the story you want to tell, you can choose, am I going to visualize this data based on, comparison of the densest cities or the most number of households, or in the case of landfill waste, for example, we look at how many tons per household are, consumed or put out at the curb in those cities. So that's just a quick look into the right-hand side of the sheet there, and it makes me think that I should include the province column back into this view. So that's something that I'll do.
Glad I could keep you on your toes. That's good. And so what we're seeing here, the breakdown by cohort, then what you're saying, Matthew, is that we could very easily break it down by province. So instead of having 3 sections in the report right now, we would have, a breakdown of all the provinces that we have data for. So that's great. So that was the first example. So relatively straightforward. Fortunately, with the green buildings data set, we've got data points for all of 2018. So let me go ahead and reset this a little bit. We're going to change gears. So I'll go ahead and delete my filters. I can delete my group by item. I'll go ahead and delete my sorts as well. So the second scenario that I wanted to look at is looking at air quality across just large cities. So similarly, again, what I want to do is add a filter in here. We're going to look at air quality. And you'll see as I type that, it automatically comes in. We mentioned that we're interested in large cohorts only. So let's go ahead and add a filter there. So for a cohort is large. And so now that's sort of the context that we have. But something interesting happens now, and you're probably going to face this challenge when you're looking at data, because no matter what data set you're looking at, what industry, the data is never perfect. There's always challenging data points that you need to deal with in your data. So if I go ahead and add a filter now, let's say, you know what, we want to look at the most recent year captured for air quality. If I turn on 2018, you can see here that we only have 1 data point for Winnipeg entered here. So how would we accommodate this scenario? So in general, what's acceptable is up to, keep me honest here, Matthew, but up to 3 years. We don't want to have a gap or compare cities that have larger than a 3-year gap between them. So what we can do is, I'm going to update this filter. So I'll go ahead and add filter just to get into the dialog. And instead of using this is, we can do is any of. So notice that as soon as I turn that on, so I can turn on and off the years. So in this case, I want to now do an analysis based on the past 2 years worth of data. So now I have quite a bit more data that comes into the report, but there is that one challenging data set, right? So if I sort by, let me just do that now, by municipality. You notice that Winnipeg here, I've got 2 data points for Winnipeg, 2018 and 2017. So what you would typically want to do is get rid of that, the second data point, so that you're not double counting in this case. So again, it comes back to understanding your data. So what I want to do is actually going to get rid of this sort.
Intervene.
Yeah.
And it's just to mention in this case, for the first data point that you have there, the first Winnipeg data point, you'll see that the source link isn't included, and on the and a data point for number of days per year with poor or moderate air quality, or anyways above 4 on the air quality health index scale. It's a little bit suspect that we would have received a submission for the year 2018, given that the year isn't over yet. So I think I would use a little bit of judgment in that. And in this case, with air quality, I would remove the 2018 from the data set. And I think we might even decide, it's rarely the case that we would do this, but we might even decide to remove that data point altogether, just because the year isn't over yet. So it's very objectively clear to me that they can't have a complete number. They can't, fully estimate. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see in the kind of alternative only compare against Ontario cities column, there are some additional methodological considerations to be made. And those that don't have a comment in the left-hand column have used the correct or the accepted methodology. The other ones, I would not recommend comparing them against each other without doing a further analysis. So we've posted them there, and the reason that we've left them there is largely to allow for chronological visualization of data. For example, Vancouver uses a special way to measure air quality, and so comparing it apples to apples with other cities might not be the best idea. Again, you'd have to kind of dig into the source link, which is what allows us to make that kind of decision sometimes. But as a rule of thumb, if there's no caveat in the left-hand column, alternative, methodology used, and could you just quickly click on the word alternative, Dave, and press the space bar?
Way on the left?
Yeah.
I just see here.
Yeah, and press the space bar. So what that does is it opens up this record in kind of a more roomy view, and you'll see that in the first column there, the indicator used an alternative methodology. So whenever you see that, you can, if you really want, dig into the source link, find out exactly what happened there, and maybe you can find a way to compare apples to apples. And I think for today's webinar, we won't bother getting into that detail, and obviously, but as I mentioned previously, the data set right now is incomplete. We did have some issues with cities submitting data that were not according to our methodologies, and that's fine, because that data is still useful for comparing a time scale of that city to itself. So at this moment, I think, David, we're going to ignore that first column, that kind of methodological wildcard column, and we can just kind of go forward and compare these to each other, apples to apples, as you were, I think, planning to do. But with the caveat for everybody else that we do need to make sure, and over time, the data set will become more robust, and we will be able to kind of lean into cities and say, hey, listen, can you actually give us this very specific data point? So there's a few caveats. Again, they're all there in the left-hand column.
Okay, great. That's good context. Right, so that's basically where I was going from here, is that how can we start to visualize this? And I know there's another webinar coming up next week, but this sort of scratches the surface on how you want to manipulate or shape the data for something sort of downstream. How do you take it and visualize it? So in this case, we were sorting on, actually I removed my sort. In this case, what I would typically want to do is sort by response. In this case, I want to sort it in descending order. Let me try that one more time. I'll reply. Right, so now we're actually counting backwards, and I need to be cognizant. I'll get rid of that Winnipeg data point, so the second last row. But what I can very easily do now is, I've been using Venngage. There's some other visualization tools. I'm simply going to copy this, and I'm going to shift gears into Venngage into a sort of visualization that I've been working on. So what we can do with the data now is we can take a chart if we wanted, a simple column chart, if you will. And there's some default data that's in this when you start working with Venngage. When I double click this, you have all the data here. So all I want to do now is delete what is with the sample, and I can actually paste in with what we had from the data set. And looking back to the data set here, I wanted to get rid of the 2018 data point for Winnipeg. This example in general is still applicable to sort of removing some of those comparisons, points that need to be removed from your analysis. So it was the second row of data here. Very easily, I can come into Venngage, choose my data row, right-click, and remove that data point. So very quickly, you can start to see the visual here. And this is the reason why I sorted it in descending order, because typically what you want to do when you're ranking or comparing cities or municipalities, descending order is a much easier way to analyze it than looking at sort of a mountain of sort of columns on that chart. So again, and what we were looking at was air quality. Matthew had some very good points about understanding the indicator, making sure it's a valid apples-to-apples comparison. But you can see here very quickly a couple pivots and sorts. We were able to look at a large cohort, do some analysis, and visualize that in a visualization tool like Venngage. So let me pause here for a second, Matthew, to see if you have any other comments.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I just to mention that in Venngage, you can also then remove the duplicates of Toronto and Ottawa.
Right. Yeah, there are a couple other ones there too. Yeah, that's very easily done. And they'll be going into more detail with regards to making this look a little prettier than just my rainbow of columns here in the chart. But yeah, that's the starting point. So I'm going to go back here to my designs for the next part.
And just one more caveat kind of about the data that we have there. There are some cases in which we collected 2 different data points for Ottawa, for example, for 2017. So you'll see there in line 6 and in line 8, you've got data points for 2007 and line 9, data points for 2017 for Ottawa. And it depends what you want to compare. If you're comparing, and this is a rare case, I will say that. So I mean, it's good that we're looking into it, but I don't think it's you're going to run across this problem elsewhere very often. And that's where we've collected data from different sources. Ottawa submitted a data set, and we also consulted other data sets that were in line with our methodology. One of them that was specific to an Ontario air quality indice. So if you want to compare just Ontario cities, then I would use the Ontario data line there. If you are going to compare, with other cities and other provinces, then use one where the methodology kind of indicator column on the far left-hand side is the same as those other ones. So you'll see alternative methodology and only compared to Ontario as another alternative methodology. So that will be, and I should, just one more caveat, that will be clarified further as we evolve. There are, again, a number of things about the open database that are still a little bit in development, but in general, everything is good to go and ready to use.
Okay, that's great. So let's take this up a little bit to deeper dive here, a little further detail. So what I want to do now is, if we want to change gears a little bit and look at public transit, for example, what I find as valuable is that it's okay to look at a column chart, but when you want to, you can really have the data tell you a compelling story when you start to look at it and cross-reference it by different data points. So as Matthew said, we have this population metric, we have per 100,000 residents, per capita, per household. So the data really starts to tell a compelling story when you start to slice it by these different data points. So let me go back here. I'm going to update some of my filters. Instead of looking at air quality, let's go ahead and look up public transit. And so that's automatically filtered. And I'll just keep my data points for 2017 at this point in time. So what we can do from here is we can actually take it a step further by bringing it into Excel and starting to manipulate the data a little bit further. And the main reason why I'm doing this now is, if I go into this visualization, the chart that I want to work with, it's called a scatter plot. Now, I really like these, and this is me sort of geeking out a little bit, because they do tell you a lot of valuable information. The reason why I have to switch this is basically just because of the format that Venngage is looking for the data. And so you're going to be using different tools, whether it's Excel or other business intelligence tools. Typically, there's going to be some data formats or manipulation that you have to do. So if you want to drag and drop columns in Excel, you can do that. I'm going to show you how I typically do it to get the data to tell a story here. So right within this visualization, what we can do is we can copy and paste again. So here I want to look at municipality. I've got my response, and I need my population as well. So I just basically did a mouse click. I held my button down, so I have municipality, response, all the way down to population. I'll do a copy again, and I'll jump into Excel, and let me blow this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. So really, I'll put the column headings in here. They're not really required. Response and population. Right, so I don't really care about these columns. I'm just going to get rid of them for my analysis here. And what I can do is, if I take this, I'm not sure how many people have done a paste special or wondered about what the transpose feature in Excel does. Well, today's your lucky day. So if we click on transpose, what it's basically going to do is flip the rows to columns and columns to rows. And so now I have the exact same data, but in a little bit different structure. So I'll just clean this up a little bit. So all I'm going to do is I'll just put some spaces in here so I can drag and drop a little bit. and one more. And so if you think back to Engage, what it basically wants is an X, Y coordinate. So against the bottom, the X axis, and then the Y axis. So it could be any data point that you want, but all I'm going to do now is plot my population against my Y axis. So I can simply move these over. And once I have all these data points, I can simply, again, copy. I'm going to go back to my visualization here in Engage. I'll delete that and do a paste. And now this is automatically plotted the data for me. So if I zoom in a little bit, what this is telling me is now is I can look at basically the number of trips that are taken in terms of public transportation based on population. So primarily you would typically expect like a linear, some sort of linear regression, a line going from the bottom left corner here to the top right. What you're typically looking at for is outliers. So Vancouver, so even though they have high ridership, they may not be doing well as some other cities here. So Toronto is way at the top. So this is one really quick example, but when you start looking at household waste, energy consumption, this is a really powerful way to have the data tell a story. And if you sit down here and look at, the cities per cohort or per province, I think it's going to facilitate some really good conversations with your elected officials and councillors, really allowing the data to tell a story for you. And so that was the third level 300 scenario I had for you, Matthew. So again, your thoughts and comments are appreciated.
Thanks, David. Yeah, one piece, the wonderful thing about Scatterplot is that it really does let you kind of see outliers. I mean, not to say that bar charts can't also do that, but what's important for anybody playing with data is to say, why is there an outlier there? And in this case, this is another case, and I'm not going to hide the truth. We are dealing with complicated issues, and there's a lot of people that looked at this and said, ooh, it's going to be tough to do. But we've done a really great job of it. And really, on this chart here, there's really only one outlier, and that's Vancouver. The reason that Vancouver is an outlier on this chart is because Metro, not Metrolinx, that's Toronto, but anyway, the Greater Vancouver Transit Authority, they report on trips. The SkyTrain crosses into Burnaby. The SkyTrain crosses into Delta, crosses into Richmond, crosses into a number of neighboring municipalities. So their transit ridership number represents the metro area and not simply Vancouver proper. And when we input the population to all of our data in the open database, the population is the municipal boundary. So if you see an outlier like that, it's up to you as an intelligent individual to say, okay, why might that be the case? And I see, transit ridership in Vancouver is measured at the regional level. And then you would take the regional population number for Vancouver and plug that in there. It remains to be seen whether or not we make all those decisions for you. And I think in the case of Vancouver, we can do that. I can go pull the right number for Vancouver's metro area for this specific data point and for the other transit ridership data points that have been submitted for Vancouver. I can do that, but it doesn't absolve data users from an analysis, a critical analysis of the data that they're using. So when you do see an outlier like that, it's a flag to say, okay, maybe there's something that needs to change. So once we take the Metro Vancouver population as opposed to just the city proper, we're going to see that that kind of orange data point move up into the kind of like 2 million kind of neighborhood on the y-axis.
So Matthew, I know he didn't coin the phrase, but when I was at the Denver training, Al Gore reminded me of the phrase that if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go as a think, as you're sort of doing your homework, preparing the meetings with any city councilors, officials, it shouldn't just be, hey, a last minute scramble to look at the data. I would encourage you to sit down, like meet the other people in the hubs close by to you, say, hey, here's the data I want to present. It's best to, prepare, do your homework ahead of time, have them poke holes in your data and your analysis before you sit down with anyone else. So again, engage with your local hubs so that, you can really be confident and understand, have the background and context as to the story that the data is telling.
Absolutely.
So that was it for me today. So just to recap, we did a couple things with regards to basic analysis. If your comfort level is just staying in Airtable, there's some really powerful things that you can do. Just grouping the data. We saw the small, medium, and large cohorts. bit of the story that Victoria was telling us with regard to green buildings. And then we started to visualize the data, prepped it a little bit in terms of what we do in Airtable, sorting it so it's nicely plotted in a column chart. And then if you want to really geek out, getting into those scatter plots and an additional sophisticated analysis, that was sort of the end-to-end presentation here. So that was it for me, Matthew. So let me hand it back, I guess, to Nadia at this point in time.
Sorry, I just have to make sure I was unmuted.
There we go.
That was great. Thank you so much, David. I love learning about this kind of stuff, especially seeing how far the data has been going so far. I just wanted to kind of share some quick updates before handing it back to Matt to close the webinar. But this is part one. Part two will be the data visualization webinar coming up with Charlotte Rebel, right? Am I saying that right? And as well, Ben Clarkson. We will also be, the final standings will be released as of next Tuesday as well. So that's also other great things to start looking forward to. And Matt, any final words?
I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, I'll just make a quick little bridge into next week's webinar. But just after that, I'd love to hear, because I know Nadia has worked within the City of Toronto, and I believe also at the provincial level. Am I?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay, and mostly in kind of these analytical positions where you're kind of digging through the data, you're finding it, you're analyzing it, you're struggling with it, you're wrangling it. I'm sure you have a good deal of data wrangling experience. So yeah, I'd love to hear from your perspective after I kind of go through one more final example of kind of where this is leading into next week. I'd love to hear from your perspective of, what you see as the challenges to this moving forward, the, just any thoughts really, any thoughts on the whole process, because you've been into municipal data for longer than most of us. So with that, I'll share my screen really briefly, and that'll give me an opportunity to just give one more example of how we can ensure that what we are calculating is, or what the work we're doing is entirely, that we're careful with the data that we're using. And we haven't really looked at a time series example yet, so I just really quickly, this is what we're going to be getting into next week. We're going to be taking data like this for Edmonton. As you can see, I've filtered for injured active commuters, so how many people are getting hit and injured, be they cyclists or rollerbladers or pedestrians. And we have a pretty complete data set in the case of Edmonton. So it's up to kind of hub members to explore the data for their cities. In the case that there's not, a ton of data, then please go and continue submitting. One of the other things I wanted to mention during that came to mind was that submissions are always welcome. Certainly there is a period of the year where we're really pushing for them and we're really encouraging them. But if you, in between now and August, which is when we will be collecting data officially again, or another big data push, you're always welcome to submit data to, complete and make the database, the open database, more robust. So long as methodologies are followed. And as you can see, not everybody follows the methodologies, which leads to some complications. But in this case, it's a good example because in Edmonton, we've got responses here that are very high compared to the other large Canadian cities. And the reason is because they haven't filtered out the minor injuries. So these are all injuries plus deaths, which means not so useful to compare city to city, unless another city is reporting with that same alternative methodology. However, very useful in terms of comparing, trends across time. And we've got, 11 years of data here. So that lets us, in Venngage, do this kind of thing, where I've pulled in just a straight bar chart of the data from 2007 to 2017. And in this case, of course, you don't want to sort by descending sort by data, but rather sort by chronological year. And the graphic design piece here obviously is not reflective. This should say something like injured active commuters, or whatever you want to call it. And that's another kind of final piece. Next week, we'll be talking a little bit more about the storytelling element as well. But it's important to not feel constrained at all by the suggestions that we make. Really, what's primordial here is what is going to be most useful, most impactful, most relevant in your local political context. And that's a question that we can't answer. No one can answer it except for people in your town and in your, you know, if you're following the evolution of road safety in Peterborough, then you are the, you know, best qualified to say, you know what, Peterborough could compare itself against these 3 other cities, and we're going to look at, you know, these indicators specifically in order to do that. So we have a bunch of suggestions, but don't think of this as a paint by numbers exercise. Think of it as a, you know, a first course in a very creative, you know, take the empty canvas that we're providing you with, and take the paint, you know, brushes and the palette of colors that we're affording you, and experiment and try to create something that is going to speak to the audience, tell a story that is relevant to your city. So with that, I think that's the only little piece that I wanted to add there at the end. Again, our database is only going to grow from here, and I'm really excited to see hundreds, and first hundreds, at least the 100 people that helped us collect all this data, use it, and then yeah, moving forward, I'm baffled that such a database doesn't already exist, and I'm really excited to be part of creating it. So thank you all for your help submitting the data, first of all. And David, thank you immensely for your help on the webinar tonight, helping us wrangle that data and taking us through some examples that are a little bit more geeking out, anyways, with the data. And so with that, I'll invite Nadia to close, actually, and if you have any thoughts on where to from here, kind of like, I don't know, barriers or any other thoughts, Nadia. Yes, you're unmuted.
Uh-oh, sorry. Okay. Any other barriers? I mean, working with City of Toronto data, specifically for climate mitigation, they're really cool data sets. I think it's really cool too when cities start to go more online and open data is more available so that the public has general access to it. What's really cool to see with data sometimes is also rapid growth. So especially what David was doing by sorting data by ascending or descending order and graphing it that way, it's a really great way to show the rate of growth in like the uptake of certain types of green initiatives over time. And sometimes they're more natural, sometimes it actually shows where other barriers might be kind of hindering the success we want to see. One of the better cases, I would say, one of the success stories I've seen is bike lanes. Bike lanes are something people want to see more of, and they're relatively cheap infrastructure to put in, and you can actually see the increase in bike kilometers over years quite rapidly because more and more neighborhoods are asking for them. So if that's an interest in your neighborhood, for example, take a look at what data is already out there and see if you can motivate a councilor to do so just based on the rate at which other neighborhoods would be moving at. I think that's just some of the general feedback I would give based on how like any citizen could use data to influence a change that they want to see in their neighborhood or city. With that said, though, that's all for today's webinar, really and truly. And next week is data visualization. And again, the final standings will be released on Tuesday. I guess that's all.
All right. Good night to all, and to all a good night.